Komla Adzoh woke before dawn, as he always did, in the small mud brick home he shared with his mother, two younger sisters, and brother in Agu Nyogbo, a village nestled in the hills of Togo's plateau region. The roosters were just beginning their morning call as he slipped quietly out of the sleeping mat he shared with his brother Kofi. At 24, Komla felt the weight of his family's future resting squarely on his shoulders. His father had died 3 years ago from an infection that should have been treatable, but the nearest clinic was 30 kilometers away, and they couldn't afford the medicine. Since then, Komla had worked their small cassava plot, supplementing their income with day labor at larger farms when work was available. "You're up early," his mother said softly from the corner, where she was already preparing the morning meal of AKPL. "I couldn't sleep," Komla replied, accepting a metal cup of water. "I was thinking about Pierre." His mother's face tightened slightly at the mention of Komla's cousin, who had left for France 5 years ago and whose occasional calls and rare remittances had become the subject of village legend. "Pierre makes promises he cannot keep," she said, her worn hands continuing to work the corn dough. "His stories grow taller each time he calls." But Komla had seen the photos Pierre sent on WhatsApp when he could afford data on his cracked smartphone. Pierre standing beside a gleaming car, Pierre in a European football jersey, Pierre with a white woman, his arm around her waist, both smiling into the camera outside a restaurant in Marseille. "The rains will be late this year," Komla said, changing the subject. They both knew what that meant. Another poor harvest, another year of struggling to pay his sister's school fees, another year of watching his mother's shoulders grow more stooped as she carried water from the communal well. After breakfast, Komla walked to the village center where a few older men had gathered under the large kapuk tree that served as their meeting place. Among them was Monsieur Semede, a retired teacher who had once worked in Lomé and was one of the few in the village who had traveled abroad. "Ah, Komla," the old man greeted him. "Come to hear more stories of the outside world, eh?" Komla smiled respectfully. "If you have time, monsieur." The old teacher gestured to the wooden bench beside him. "I always have time for a curious mind." For the next hour, Monsieur Semede spoke of European football clubs, of cities like Paris and London, of economies that needed young workers. Komla listened intently, memorizing names and details. FC Barcelona, Manchester United, the construction boom in France, the aging population of Europe needing care workers. But remember, the teacher cautioned, lowering his voice, for every success story like your cousin Pierre claims, there are 100 untold stories of hardship, of men sleeping under bridges, of broken dreams. Komla nodded respectfully, but in his mind, he was already calculating. Pierre had mentioned that his European wife had friends. Many European women, Pierre had said in their last call, were looking for authentic relationships with African men. And the football scouts, Pierre swore they were always watching young talent from Africa. That afternoon, as Komla worked the dry soil of their cassava plot, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a WhatsApp message from Pierre, rare enough to be momentous. "I'm coming home next month," it read. "Big news. Life-changing opportunity for you if you're serious." Komla stared at the message, his heart racing. This was it. The chance he'd been waiting for. Komla stared at the message, his heart racing. This was it. The chance he'd been waiting for. His fingers trembled as he typed a reply. "I'm ready, cousin. Whatever it takes." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parched fields, Komla looked toward the horizon where the mountains met the sky. Beyond those peaks lay Lomé, then the vast ocean, and finally Europe, with all its promises and perils. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind raced with visions of football stadiums, gleaming cities, and envelopes of cash sent home to his mother. But Monsieur Semede's warnings echoed too, like distant thunder before a storm. When he finally drifted off, Komla dreamed of standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the village, to the life he knew, difficult but predictable. The other vanished into fog, offering either salvation or destruction. What would Pierre's life-changing opportunity really mean? What sacrifices would it demand? And could Komla trust his cousin's glittering promises when so many others had returned broken? If they returned at all? Pierre's return to Agunyogbo caused a stir. He arrived in a rented Toyota Land Cruiser, wearing designer sunglasses and clothes that looked stiff with newness. Children trailed behind the vehicle as it navigated the rutted dirt paths, and women paused in their work to watch. "My brother!" Pierre embraced Komla with one arm, the scent of unfamiliar cologne enveloping them both. "You've grown stronger." That evening, after a feast that depleted Komla's family's resources, but which tradition demanded, Pierre revealed his proposal over palm wine behind Komla's home. "I know a woman in Marseille," Pierre said, lowering his voice though they were alone. "Claudine. She's 42, divorced, no children. She works in hospital administration. She's looking for companionship." Komla studied his cousin's face in the dim light. "Marriage?" Pierre shrugged. "Eventually, perhaps. These European women, they're different. They want to help, to feel connected to something authentic. She's already helped 3 men from Cameroon get residency permits." "And what does she want in return?" Komla asked. Pierre laughed, a sound that seemed practiced. "Companionship, like I said. You're handsome, educated enough, respectful. You can learn French quickly. You already know some. And you have a story that will move her. Your father's death, your struggle to support your family." Komla felt something uncomfortable shift in his stomach. "So I would be... what? Pretending to love this woman?" "Think of it as an arrangement that benefits everyone," Pierre said smoothly. "She gets a young, devoted husband. You get a new life in Europe, papers, the chance to bring your family later. It's not so different from how our parents' marriages were arranged." Later that night, unable to sleep, Komla opened his phone and scrolled through football videos on YouTube. Since childhood, he had played with remarkable skill, captaining his school team, even participating in regional tournaments. Coaches had praised his natural talent, his vision on the field, his powerful left foot. "The football option is riskier," Pierre had admitted when Komla brought it up. "But I know someone who knows someone at AS Monaco's youth academy. For 5 million CFA francs, about 7,600 euros, he can arrange a trial." 5 million CFA francs might as well have been 5 billion. It was an impossible sum for Komla's family. The next morning, Komla walked to the small internet cafe in the neighboring larger village of Kapalime. He spent an hour researching European immigration policies, marriage visa requirements, and football academy trials. The more he read, the more complicated everything seemed. WhatsApp messages from European women claiming to seek African husbands flooded certain forums. Testimonials from men who had successfully married Europeans and established lives abroad. Photos of African footballers who had been discovered by European scouts and now played for top clubs. But there were also warnings, stories of scams, reports of men who had paid for football trials that never materialized, accounts of marriages that ended in deportation once the residency permit was secured. On his walk back to Agunyogbo, Komla passed a group of teenagers playing football on a dusty pitch with a ball that had been repaired multiple times. He paused to watch, admiring their skill despite the challenging conditions. One boy, no more than 14, executed a perfect bicycle kick that reminded Komla of his own younger days. "You still play well," came a voice behind him. It was Monsieur Semede, leaning on his walking stick. Not as much as I should, Komla admitted. Your father was proud of your talent, the old teacher said. He used to tell everyone his son would play for the national team one day. The mention of his father stung Komla. Dreams cost money, monsieur. Yes, the old man agreed, but selling your dignity costs more. 2 weeks after Pierre's arrival, Komla found himself sitting across from Claudine on a video call. Pierre had arranged everything, coaching Komla on what to say, how to present himself, what stories to tell about his family's hardships. Claudine was attractive in a mature way, her blonde hair cut in a stylish bob, her apartment visible in the background looking spacious and modern by Togolese standards. She spoke slowly in French, smiling often, asking Komla about his life, his dreams, his family. Pierre has told me so much about you, she said, about your father, about how hard you work for your family. It's very admirable. Komla felt himself blushing, partly from the compliment, partly from shame at the performance he was giving. He had emphasized his family's poverty, described his sister's lack of educational opportunities in more dire terms than was strictly true, spoken of his dream to become a nurse in France and send money home. I believe we could help each other, Claudine said toward the end of the call. I can sponsor your visa application as my fiancé. It would take some time, but within a year, you could be in Marseille. After the call, Pierre was ecstatic. She likes you. I told you she would. This is your ticket out, cousin. Your family's salvation. But that night, as the full moon illuminated the courtyard outside their home, Komla's mother found him sitting alone, troubled. This woman, she said, settling beside him, you do not love her. It wasn't a question. In their small village, privacy was limited. Pierre's scheme was poorly concealed. She seems kind, Komla offered weakly. His mother was silent for a long moment. When I married your father, it was arranged by our families, but we grew to love each other deeply. Love can come after marriage. This is true. She paused. But a marriage built on lies is like a house built on sand. The next day, as if fate were testing him, Komla received another message, this one from David Abelot, a former teammate who had managed to secure a position coaching youth football in Lomé. FC Metz is sending scouts to Togo next month, the message read. They're looking for players under 25 for their reserve team. I mentioned your name. It's a long shot, but if you can get to Lomé for the tryouts, who knows? Komla stared at the message until his phone screen went dark. FC Metz, a real French club with a history of developing African talent. This wasn't like Pierre's vague connection who required millions of CFA francs up front. This was a legitimate opportunity, but even this had its costs. The bus fare to Lomé, accommodations for potentially several days, proper football boots that weren't falling apart, expenses his family could ill afford. That evening, he found Pierre drinking with friends at the small outdoor bar at the village's edge. I need to talk to you, Komla said, pulling his cousin aside. Pierre listened impatiently as Komla explained about the football tryouts, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. This is a fantasy, Pierre said dismissively. Do you know how many talented African players never make it? Do you know how many scams there are? Claudine is real. She has a real apartment, a real job. She's offering you a real future. But built on what? Komla challenged. On me pretending to love her? On using her loneliness? Pierre's face hardened. You think Europeans care about us? They extracted our resources for centuries. They drew our borders without asking. They owe us. Claudine wants a young, handsome African husband to show off to her friends, to make her feel charitable and progressive. You want a path out of poverty. It's a fair exchange. Komla walked away, unconvinced but conflicted. The day before Komla had to give Pierre his answer about Claudine, a football match was organized between Agu-Nyogbo and a neighboring village. It was a tradition dating back generations. usually held after harvest, but this year it had been moved earlier due to the uncertain rains. Komla hadn't planned to play. At 24, he was considered past his prime in a village where most men were worn down by hard labor by their 30s. But when the team captain twisted his ankle in the first half, Komla was called from the sidelines. The familiar feel of the pitch beneath his feet, even this uneven, stone-strewn dirt field, awakened something in him. His first touch was tentative, his second more confident. By his third possession, Komla was playing with a freedom he hadn't felt in years. Unknown to him, among the spectators was Adzoh Mensah, a Ghanaian football agent who was visiting family in a nearby village. Mensah watched with professional interest as Komla controlled the midfield. His passes accurate, his vision exceptional, his left-footed shot powerful and precise. After Komla scored his second goal, a 30-meter strike into the upper corner that sent the village spectators into celebration, Mensah approached Monsieur Semede. "Who is that player? Number 10? He asked in French. The old teacher eyed him suspiciously. "Why do you ask?" Mensah handed him a business card. "I work with several European clubs scouting talent in West Africa. That young man has something special." After the match, which Agunyogbo won 3-1 with Komla scoring twice and assisting the third goal, Mensah introduced himself. His offer was direct. He would arrange for Komla to attend the FC Metz tryouts in Lomé, covering his expenses. If Komla impressed the scouts, Mensah would negotiate on his behalf. If not, there was no obligation. "What's your fee?" Komla asked suspiciously, remembering Pierre's warnings about scams. 20% of your first contract," Mensah replied. "I only get paid if you succeed, and I only work with players I believe in." That night, Komla faced the most difficult conversation of his life. Pierre was furious when Komla told him he would not pursue the arrangement with Claudine. "You're throwing away a guaranteed future for a football fantasy," Pierre shouted. "Do you know how hard I worked to set this up for you? How much I've invested in this?" "I can't build my life on a lie," Komla said quietly. "And football isn't just a fantasy for me. It's the one thing I've always excelled at." When you're still stuck in this village 5 years from now, with more mouths to feed and no prospects, remember this moment, Pierre said bitterly. "Remember you chose pride over practicality." 2 weeks later, Komla stood among 50 young hopefuls at a football facility in Lomé. The FC Metz scouts, 2 Frenchmen with clipboards and serious expressions, ran the players through drills, small-sided games, and finally a full match simulation. By the end of the day, Komla's lungs burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion. He had given everything, showcasing his technical abilities, his tactical understanding, his natural athleticism. As the players gathered to hear the scouts' decisions, Komla's thoughts drifted to his family. Had he made the right choice? Had he thrown away a secure path to Europe? "The following players should remain after," one of the scouts announced, beginning to read from his clipboard. "Kojo Amuzu, Salom Adedze, Komla Adzoh." Komla's heart nearly stopped as he heard his name. He was one of only 5 players selected for further evaluation. The next day, the remaining players were subjected to medical examinations, interviews, and more targeted training sessions. By sundown, the scouts had made their final selections. "Komla Adzoh," the head scout said, "we would like to invite you to a 3-month trial with FC Metz's reserve team in France. If you perform well, there is potential for a professional contract." Mensah, who had watched the entire process, clapped Komla on the shoulder. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The real work starts now." 3 months later, Komla stood in the arrivals hall of Metz Nancy Lorraine Airport, clutching a small duffel bag containing everything he owned. The air smelled different here, cleaner, cooler, with subtle scents he couldn't identify. People rushed past, most ignoring the slender African man trying to orient himself in this new world. A young woman approached, holding a sign with his name. Komla Adzoh, I'm Sophie Leroux from FC Metz's player development team. Welcome to France. The drive to the club's facilities gave Komla his first glimpse of European life outside of internet images and television. The roads were smooth, the buildings solid and numerous, the greenery meticulously maintained. It was both exactly as he'd imagined, completely foreign. Your accommodations will be in the Youth Academy dormitory, Sophie explained. You'll share a room with Amadou, a midfielder from Senegal. Training starts tomorrow at 9 a.m. That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Komla video called his family. His mother's face, illuminated by the glow of a neighbor's borrowed smartphone, brought unexpected tears to his eyes. The buildings are so tall, he told her, turning his phone to show the view from his window. And there are lights everywhere, even at night. Are you eating well? She asked, her primary concern universal to mothers everywhere. Better than ever, he assured her, though the unfamiliar European food had been challenging to his palate. His youngest sister, Amma, pushed her face close to the screen. Will you play against Cristiano Ronaldo? Komla laughed. Not quite yet, little one. I have to earn my place first. The following weeks tested Komla physically, mentally, and emotionally. The training was more intense than anything he'd experienced. The tactical demands more complex, the competition fierce. There were moments of crushing doubt when he wondered if Pierre had been right, if he had chosen a fool's path. His breakthrough came during a reserve team match against AS Nancy's reserves. Coming on as a substitute with his team trailing 2-0, Komla scored twice and created the winning goal with a perfectly weighted pass. The reserve team coach, initially skeptical of the raw talent from Togo, began giving him more minutes, more responsibility. By the end of his 3-month trial, Komla had done enough to earn a 1-year contract with the reserve team, modest by European football standards, but life-changing for him and his family. Mensa negotiated diligently, securing educational opportunities and performance bonuses in addition to the base salary. On the day Komla signed his contract, he received a WhatsApp message from Pierre. Claudine got married last week to a man from Benin. Komla stared at the message, recognizing the implicit accusation. You missed your chance. But as he looked around the professional football club that was now his employer, at the contract that would allow him to send his sisters to better schools and provide for his mother, he felt no regret. He typed back, I wish them happiness. 6 months into his contract, Komla scored a spectacular goal during a reserve match attended by the first team coach. The following week, he was invited to train with the main squad. Though he didn't make the matchday roster, the experience confirmed he was on the right path. That evening, he walked through a park near the club facilities, marveling at the orderliness of European public spaces. A group of children were playing football, using backpacks as goalposts. They waved him over, recognizing him as a FC Metz player from his training gear. As Komla joined their impromptu game, showing the children tricks and techniques, he reflected on his journey. He hadn't taken the path Pierre had suggested, marrying a European woman he didn't love for papers and prosperity, nor had he become an overnight football sensation playing in the Champions League. Instead, he was building something authentic, a career based on his genuine talent, hard work, and passion. He had chosen the harder road, the uncertain path, but one that allowed him to look at himself in the mirror each morning without shame. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. Amma won first prize in her school mathematics competition. The new books you sent helped her study. Komla smiled, sliding the phone back into his pocket. The road ahead remained challenging. His position wasn't guaranteed. His football career might flourish or falter. But he had chosen to pursue a dream rooted in truth rather than convenience. And somehow, that made all the difference. In the fading European twilight, so different from the abrupt sunsets of Togo, Komla laughed as one of the children executed a clumsy attempt at a rainbow flick. He corrected the boy's technique gently, demonstrating the proper motion. Again, Komla encouraged in his improving French. Try again. In football, as in life, persistence matters more than perfect beginnings. Love African stories? Want more tales of romance, adventure, and culture? Subscribe to Folktale Africa for more breathtaking stories that celebrate the heart of Africa. Click here to subscribe now